ayes have it. And so we proceed to the second opposition day motion. I'll just pause for a moment to allow a change of dramatis personae on the front benches. We come to the... Yeah, come on, quite quickly, please. Not time for chatting. We come to the second opposition day motion on ministerial severance. I call Emily Thornberry to propose the motion.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion in my name and that in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Today we seek the permission of the House to make time for legislation in the weeks ahead to reform the system for ministerial severance payments. Those payments were first introduced exactly 40 years ago for ministers in the House of Lords, with rules that were almost identical to the ones that now apply to this House as well. Departing ministers were to receive a quarter of their annual salary, equivalent to 3 months of pay, provided that they were under the age of 65, provided that they had been in post for at least 2 years, and provided that they did not return to that job within 3 weeks. Yes, of course I will.
I thank my friend to give way, and may I reassure Mr Deputy Speaker, I have informed the member for Great Yarmouth I'll be referring to him personally in this debate, and we couldn't have this debate without him. He's the only minister of the 97 who claimed 2 severance payments in 22-23, totalling almost £33,000. The second payment were 3 months' pay after just 7 weeks in the job as Justice Secretary. Does my honourable friend agree with me that at the height of a cost of living crisis, it was nothing short of a disgrace that the member for Great Yarmouth felt entitled to claim so much money from the taxpayer when delivering so little in return?
The Honourable Lady is spot on, and for those on the other side muttering about claiming it, it doesn't really matter if it was claimed, if it was given to them and not given back. The point is it was still pocketed by the Right Honourable Member, and it was not done in accordance with rules that anyone was expecting them to be used in this way, and that is the point of this debate. The payments were extended to other ministers, if I may make a bit of progress, and then of course I will. The payments were extended to other ministers in 1991 based on a recommendation by what the then top Salaries Review Board, which commanded broad cross-party support. The only change from the previous rules was to remove the 2-year qualifying limit, but it is worth noting that in every debate which preceded the 1991 legislation, MPs remained clear that these payments were intended for the benefit of long-serving ministers. Ministers who were having to make what Geoffrey Howe called an abrupt and significant financial adjustment after relinquishing their ministerial office. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
The Honourable Lady accept that when our party came into power in 2010, not only did we cut ministerial pay, we have kept it frozen ever since. In the unlikely event of her side getting into power, would she commit to maintain that freeze?
If the Honourable Lady has a moment to look at the motion before us today and to consider it in the spirit of fairness and the way in which public money should be spent, I hope that she will agree that the current system has been abused over the last few years by her colleagues in the chamber and outside it, and that it is simply not the sort of thing that the public would... I mean, the public would be appalled if they knew what was going on here. So, those are the severance payments we're talking about today. I'm going to make a bit more progress and then I will give way. So those are the severance payments that we're talking about today. There may be red herrings, there may be other issues that members opposite wish to speak about, but let's talk about severance payments and the abuse of the severance payment system that we have seen over the last few years, because I do think that we should take a clear-eyed look at it. These are the severance payments we're talking about today. We are not seeking to scrap them, nor should we. As Geoffrey Howe said, they were introduced so ministers who had given long and dedicated service to their country could adjust to the loss of that salary. I don't think anyone on this side has any quarrel with that, and over the 40 years that those payments have existed, there has never been any previous question, any previous occasion where it has been open to question that the rules by which those payments are made are wrong. But then we came to 2022-2023, a year of chaos in our politics, unprecedented in modern times, and sadly, a year in which the current severance scheme had its flaws suddenly exposed and its loopholes shamelessly exploited. Yes. However, before I address what went wrong with the system in that financial year, I want to do something first that I find personally very unusual, and that is to praise some members of the Conservative cabinet. It's going to be hard for me, and I feel my ancestors on my side of the family starting to shift uneasily in their graves, but I want to give credit where credit is due. And that credit goes to a small collection of Secretaries of State who, for want of a better phrase, did the right thing when it came to severance entitlements during that year of chaos. I want to praise the current DEFRA Secretary, the member for North East Cambridgeshire, who was sacked as Health Secretary in September 2022, but reinstated by the current Prime Minister 7 weeks later. And what did he do with his severance payment? He returned it in full when he regained his old job, so he deserves praise for that. I want to praise the current Secretary of State for Science, the member for Chippenham, who resigned after 2 days as Education Secretary in July 2022, but turned down £16,000 plus severance payment, for which those 2 days had made her eligible, and she too deserves praise for that. I even want to praise the member for South Staffordshire, the former Chief Whip, the former Defence Secretary, the former Education Secretary, who claimed his £16,000 plus severance in 2019 when he was sacked for leaking top-secret information, who claimed his £16,000 plus severance again in 2021 when he was sacked for all his various school fiascos, but who finally turned down his severance payment in 2023 after 2 weeks in the Cabinet Office because he recognised that it would be inappropriate to accept while under investigation for bullying. So let us praise him for that, if for nothing else. But what those examples show, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that it is entirely possible for individuals to choose to waive their severance payments or return them when they feel that accepting them would not be right. Perhaps those individuals even reflected that at the height of the cost of living crisis, which had been greatly exacerbated by the actions of their government, that it would seem inappropriate to accept thousands of pounds from the taxpayer as a reward for the contribution that they had made to that chaos. Perhaps they realised how much of a smack in the face that would feel to their constituents. Either way, those individuals did do the right thing. However, the hard fact is that and numbers bear this out, that for every one case in the last financial year where a Tory minister decided that accepting that severance payment would be inappropriate in the circumstances, there were at least 6 or 7 other cases where the opposite was unfortunately true. And that is why we find ourselves here today, trying to fix a system of ministerial severance that has been brought into disrepute by dozens of its most recent beneficiaries. Yes, of course I will.
She has mentioned many secretaries of state, but we did also have a very short-lived Prime Minister who is entitled for some payments for the rest of her life. Do we not also think that this should be looked at to see whether it is appropriate for people who leave in disgrace to end up with lifelong paycheques?
The Honourable Gentleman makes an important point, and is an important argument that I think will need to be considered. For the purposes... Yes, I will, of course.
Briefly, I'm very grateful to her. As she is, the argument she is making that there is a certain culture which has grown up under successive Conservative governments which is lax and which benefits few but taints us all. I think it goes beyond severance pay, in fact. My right honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere and Dwyfor, has proposed a private member's bill, the Elected Representatives Prohibition of Deception Bill, which would make it an offence for ministers to knowingly and wilfully lie to the public. Is there any chance that an incoming Labour government might adopt it?
If we were given the great honour of serving the public as the next government, our ministers will not be deceiving the public. And we will be straightforward, and we will do our utmost to serve them to the best of our ability. And we will be a government to be proud of. We just need to have an opportunity. For the purposes of explaining our motion, I will go through each of the 5 categories where a flaw in the rules was exposed in 2022-23, and I will give one example each of how someone benefited, each of whom I have informed, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I'm going to be raising their case. So first, All right, before I move on, I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Shadow Minister giving way, and I know this is an Opposition Day debate and the government gets bashed. It's part of the convention and traditions of this House. But an important constitution point, if I may, the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town, I think, was alluding to the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk. Does she agree that whether it be Labour, ex-Labour Prime Ministers, ex-Conservative Prime Ministers, I don't think we'll ever have a Lib Dem one, thankfully, we can agree on that, that they should have no private office arrangements supported by the state, given that they have been at the highest First Lord of the Treasury, access to top secret and classified materials, clearly under probably constant threat for the rest of their lives? Is she honestly saying that a Labour government would no longer support former Prime Ministers of whatever political party?
I'm saying that this is an important issue that needs to be considered, and I would suggest that perhaps the two gentlemen together put in for a debate so that we're able to air these matters properly. But today I want to talk about ministerial severance payments because there are some... I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman, and then I hope I won't need to give way to him again.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Lady, the Right Honourable Lady, for giving way. Isn't this just an example of why this motion before the House is so ill thought out? Because we're getting good ideas, interesting ideas coming up from her own benches. They're not in the motion. This is not the way, Mr Deputy Speaker, to create legislation. Does she not agree?
I'm proud to say that my party is full of good ideas, and unfortunately we are unable to put them all into one motion. But today, let us have a little discipline, please, by concentrating on the motion at hand and the important issue that we are raising today, because there are 5 particular problems which we believe were highlighted by the chaos in 22-23. And I want to go through each of them, give an example, and then explain why the changes that we want to put forward before this House will solve those problems, and why we would therefore ask the House as a whole to consider very seriously the proposal that we have made and to ensure that we can pass legislation to change the situation, because it does need to be fixed. So first, let's look at what I call the short stayers problem. So more than 24 individuals occupied front bench roles for just 9 weeks at the fag end of the Johnson government, or just 7 weeks during the bedlam of the Truss experiment, but all of whom walked away with 3 months of severance pay. I mean, let us look at the member for Stoke-on-Trent North as an example. Never a shrinking violet when it comes to calling out others, and he just served 49 full days as a minister in the Department for Education, earning less than £3,000 in wages, and yet, when he returned to the backbenches, he received almost double that amount in severance. 3 months severance for 49 days' work. Perhaps the Minister for Common Sense will tell us whether that makes sense to her. Second, we have the problem of the short-lived promotions. Individuals who found themselves elevated from junior ministerial roles to more senior positions, and whose severance was therefore calculated not based on the salary that they had earned for most of the year, but on the much higher salary that they had earned for only a few weeks. So let us think of the example of the member for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland. He spent a year as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, earning a salary of almost £32,000, but then spent 7 weeks as Levelling Up Secretary on a salary of more than double that amount. As a result of the 7 weeks alone, he received severance pay of almost £17,000. And again, I look forward to the Minister for Common Sense explaining where the sense is in that. Third, We have what I might call the quick returners, more than a dozen ministers who claimed their 3 months in severance after quitting the Johnson government or being sacked by his successor, but who ended up returning to the front bench just a matter of weeks later, while still enjoying the benefits of their severance payments. Take the member for Plymouth Moor View, who didn't just accept 3 months in severance after only 2 months as Veterans Minister, who didn't just tell the Plymouth Herald point blank that he hadn't accepted a severance payment, but who also had the sheer chutzpah to return to exactly the same job 7 weeks later without paying a single penny. Once again, I hope that the expert on these matters will tell us whether that sounds like common sense. Fourth, and this is a much smaller category, and I've decided it's probably best not to give them a name at all, we also saw severance payments awarded in 2022-23 to 2 individuals, Peter Bone and Chris Pincher, who left their front bench jobs despite being under investigation at the time for acts of gross misconduct. Now, the 1991 rules were silent on this issue, and we can only assume that they thought any individual forced to quit in those circumstances would have the basic decency not to accept a handout from the taxpayer. But I'm afraid that what the Pincher and Bone cases have shown us is that we cannot rely on the decency of individuals like that. Finally, and perhaps most incredibly, there were 5 severance payments in the last financial year made entirely by mistake, because the government forgot to apply the age limit, which says no one over the age of 65 can receive one. That is how Peter Bone and Nadine Dorris received their payments, and before the current incumbents of the Cabinet Office tell themselves that they've brought order to all this chaos, it is worth noting that the largest of those mistaken payments was to one of the Lords Ministers, was not made during the chaos of the summer and autumn of 2022, but was made in what one might call the cold light of day in January 2023. Mr Deputy Speaker, the proposed changes to the severance rules set out in Labour's motions today would address each of the 5 issues that I have set out above. Of course I will give way.
Would she agree with me in describing these situations that had that been a constituent of any one of ours, face to face with the DWP, that the results might have been different?
And I think for any of our constituents struggling because they're finding difficulty making their wage packet get to the end of the week, seeing the amounts of money that are being handed out as essentially payment for failure, would be astonished that this was allowed. And that's why we're trying to change the rules today. Of course.
In her meaningless and bitter speech, she is missing the essential point that I think ought to be at the heart of her argument, which is when people are struggling, is galling that people who already earn an £80,000 a year salary for being a Member of Parliament and then earn more on top of that for their ministerial duties are then given another payment when, for whatever reasons, the Prime Minister doesn't like them, they perhaps haven't done a particularly good job, then get a severance package. Isn't the truth of the matter, Mr Deputy Speaker, that what Labour should be calling for is that there should be no severance packages for any minister when they lose their job?
If our motion doesn't go far enough for the honourable gentleman, let me propose this to him, that he votes with us tonight anyway, because at least we're on the road in the right direction. Whereas if his colleagues were simply to vote tonight to keeping the status quo, that he presumably will have a great deal of difficulty explaining to his constituents how, given his views, he has allowed the status quo to continue. So, let me move on to. So I was the rules that we wish to put forward, the changes that we want to make in order to deal with the 5 issues. So to deal with short stays and short-term promotions, ministers would be paid a quarter of their actual earnings over the previous 12 months, not a quarter of their final salary. To deal with the quick returners, our reforms would require individuals who return to the front bench while still enjoying the benefits of their severance payments to repay the corresponding amount. And to deal with those who do not deserve any payment, we would demand that ministers who quit while under investigation for gross misconduct or breaching a ministerial code would have their severance payment withheld unless or until their name is cleared. If all those rules had been in place in 2022-23, the member for Stoke-on-Trent North would have received £748 in severance, not almost £6,000. The short-lived Levelling Up secretary would have received just over £9,000, not almost £17,000. The member for Plymouth Moorview would have received £1,300, not almost £8,000. And the former members for Tamworth and Wellingborough would have received exactly what they deserved, which is nothing at all. And in total, Mr Deputy Speaker, if the proposals in our motion had been in place in 2022-23 and the age limit rules had been properly enforced, the total severance bill that year would have been cut by more than 40%, a savings for the taxpayer of almost £380,000. If our rules had been in place, 75 of the 97 ministers who claimed severance pay in that year would have seen their payments reduced by an average of just over £5,000. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, that is why our motion is so important. But members opposite may reasonably ask the question, why is this motion so urgent? Why is it necessary to reform the rules in this way? Why does Labour need to take control of the order paper? And I tell them, very simply, this. If they think what happened in the last financial year was a one-off aberration that could not happen again, they haven't been paying attention. Do they not know about the plotting of their own colleagues and the plans for yet another palace coup against the current incumbent of Downing Street? Yet again, in the coming months, we could see mass resignations from the front bench to put pressure on a weak and failed Prime Minister. Yet again, we could see a reform-adjacent radical put in his place, eager to engage in experiments with the British economy. And yet again, we could see it all go horribly wrong, leading to heaven knows what in the aftermath. And frankly, Mr Deputy Speaker, if that is how the party opposite wants to spend their time between now and the general election, part of me wants to say, well, just get on with it then. But you know, a bigger part of me says that they should not be allowed to gamble again with the futures of the British people, and they should certainly not be allowed to profit again from the results of their own failures. Indeed, it would be a shameful indictment of our political system if we were to allow yet another round of excessive and undeserved ministerial severance payments between now and the next election, when we have the opportunity to stop that happening today. So, my final word for now, I want to appeal to the members opposite, who I mentioned at the outset of my speech, and a handful of others like them, who decided to turn back and to send back their severance payments in 2022-23, who chose to accept smaller amounts or decided to repay part of what they had received. In the circumstances that they found themselves, and I hope in the circumstances that they saw their constituents facing, those individuals made a personal choice to do the right thing. And I hope that at the end of this debate, they will make another personal choice and decide to do the right thing again. They have the opportunity today to restore the rules on severance payments back to the purpose for which they were originally intended, and to fix the system which their colleagues have sadly broken. If they do not take that opportunity, then the conclusion we will have to draw, and perhaps the right conclusion after all, is that the only way to get a change that we need in this country will be to elect a Labour government to put MPs and ministers on those benches opposite who believe in serving their communities, not just in helping themselves.
The question is, as on the order paper. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, it was very interesting to hear the Labour Party, yes, the Labour Party, make the case that the terms and conditions of workers should be changed unilaterally in one day without consultation and without a proper review. I'm sure their union paymasters will be fascinating with the case that the Right Honourable Lady is making today. So may I start by making clear the motion before the House departs from the fundamental principle that it is the government of the day, that's the party that won the election, voted in by the public, is able to determine the business of the House. This is something that the House itself has long recognised in Standing Order number 14. In setting aside Standing Order number 14, this motion will enable the opposition to bring in a bill and race it through Parliament by proceeding with all its substantive common stages in one day. The truth is, Mr Deputy Speaker, if the Right Honourable Lady is so keen on deciding the business of the day in the House, then she shouldn't have supported her neighbour, the Right Honourable Member for Islington North, to be the Prime Minister. Given she did support him, she clearly isn't that keen in being in charge of parliamentary business. Now, whilst in exceptional circumstances it's sometimes necessary for Parliament to legislate at pace and in response to emergencies, this is not a policy matter which warrants setting aside the procedure of the House. To do so would inhibit proper parliamentary scrutiny. Mr Deputy Speaker, we have just had an Opposition Day debate on knife crime, which has gone through the roof in Sadiq Khan's London. Doesn't it say everything about the priorities of the Labour Party that they propose emergency legislation for this debate and not for that debate? I will indeed give way.
Well, perhaps it's time to start talking in the third minute of her speech about the topic, which is, of course, ministerial severance pay. It's a topic that the Minister for Common Sense has some personal experience of. In 2015, 2018 and 2020, as I understand, and she may well soon be eligible again, of course. In the meantime, can she tell us how did she decide which of the payments for which she was eligible to accept and which to turn down? And does she think decisions about what to accept should remain at the discretion of the individual, even in cases where they are guilty of gross misconduct?
The Honourable Member raises a point about redundancy payments, because that's fundamentally what we're talking about. Severance pay is a redundancy payment, and for ministers, they can be turfed out of office without any notice, without notice of termination, without any proper consultation, and they were given what would be redundancy payments. So I absolutely agree that people have accepted those redundancy payments, just like when the Prime Minister changed from Blair to Brown, those Labour ministers did. Just like in 2010, when Labour went out of office, those Labour ministers did. But I will carry on for a little while longer, because I want to say, and we will talk about what the opposition is doing today, because I answered it right from the start, seizing the business of the day, trying to make this an emergency case of legislation, which it's not, and pointing out there are so many other emergencies that actually confront the country and the world. But the fact is quite striking that of all of those emergency issues facing the country, it could be Middle East, it could be Ukraine, it could be illegal migration, the opposition deemed this more important than any one of those for emergency legislation. And we know why. Because they haven't a plan to deal with any of those big issues of the day, haven't got a plan, don't know what to say, don't have a clue, and they change their mind flippity-flop all the time. So they have been reduced, quite frankly, to talking about this issue. Now, given the importance that the Right Honourable Lady has for this issue, wanting to seize the business of the day, wanting to push through emergency legislation, can she therefore confirm this will be the first piece of legislation any new Labour government would introduce?
No, because we're going to win the vote today. We're going to win the vote today because common sense will prevail. And common sense will prevail, and we will know that it actually has to be sorted out now. You don't need to wait for a Labour government. You guys can help us pass this legislation.
So it isn't going to happen today, but quite frankly, they're not going to do it if, and hopefully they won't, come into power, because that's how much of an emergency it is. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, there is some good news here. The Right Honourable Lady is putting herself at the vanguard of cutting waste. must be the first for the Labour Party. So will the Right Honourable Lady take this opportunity to apologise for the PFI schemes her party inflicted on this country and on much of the country's public services? Will she take this opportunity to apologise for the waste? That's hundreds of billions of pounds worth of waste. I will give way if the Right Honourable Lady would like to make an apology right now for those huge amounts of waste, PFI waste.
Oh, wait. Can we go to PPE waste, perhaps, and the £10 billion on that? But really, I do think that the Honourable Lady ought to consider actually talking about ministerial severance reform. Yeah. But, I mean, it's a matter for her. Yes, quite.
So we couldn't apologise, couldn't stop the waste, didn't want to stop the waste for hundreds of billions of pounds worth of waste that the Labour Party gave. No, I'll carry on. The government accepts, and I will say this, the government accepts that this legislation is now a third of a century old, and that it may be an appropriate time to review it and consider changes. This is not, however, the right time or place to do it. Proper consideration needs to be given to new legislation. Members will be aware that severance pay is governed by legislation. The statutory provision for ministerial severance pay is contained in the Ministerial and Other Pensions and Salaries Act 1991. It has therefore been in place for successive administrations, and severance has been paid to ministers from all three parties that have held ministerial office during this time. Under the Act, a minister who leaves office is entitled to a payment equivalent to 1/4 of the annual salary they were being paid in respect of the ministerial office they are leaving. To be eligible for a payment, the minister must be under a certain age, 65, and not be reappointed to the ministerial office within 3 weeks of leaving their previous office. I note, and I thank the Right Honourable Member who tabled this debate for drawing this to my attention, that in 2022 a small number of severance payments were paid incorrectly to departing ministers. I want to be clear that the Cabinet Office guidance to departments is that they should seek to recover any mispayment in line with His Majesty's Treasury guidance on managing public money. While the incorrect payments were caused by an administrative error and the former ministers concerned were absolutely no personal fault whatsoever, it is important that the government seeks to recover that money. Now, when Labour was last in office, I'm sure I'm not the only one who recalls the catastrophic overpayments of tax credits, and that many families got into huge difficulties because of this. It's such a shame that the Right Honourable Lady wasn't so exercised about that when they were there. No, because we're talking about waste, we're talking about appropriate measures taking place, and this faux emergency legislation that the Right Honourable Lady wants to bring in. Now, turning to the issue of ministerial severance pay more generally, it is important to note that this is a long-standing policy which successive governments from both sides of the House have retained. The reason they've retained it is because the principle of paying severance remains sound. The Prime Minister, in his constitutional role as a principal adviser to the Sovereign, can recommend the appointment and removal of ministers at any time. This flexibility, necessary as it is within our political system, means that having a reasonable severance pay policy to reflect the uncertain nature of ministerial office has had wide support from across the House since its introduction. Mr Deputy Speaker, members will be aware that similar arrangements are in place for members of Parliament, who also hold the status of office holder. Under certain circumstances, members of Parliament who lose a seat at a general election are eligible to receive a loss of office payment. The eligibility for the loss of office payment is determined by the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, which is responsible for setting and regulating MPs' salaries, pensions, business costs and expenses. Severance payments recognise the unpredictable nature of ministerial office. In fact, that a minister can lose their office with no notice when the government or Prime Minister changes this will inevitably lead to a substantial increase in the money paid out in that financial year. From a sedentary position, we get £1 million quoted at me. I do remember, maybe the Right Honourable Lady doesn't, it was £1 million over in 2010 when Labour lost office. And that's quite a long time ago. It's quite a long time ago. It is for these reasons that the Government does not currently intend to reform severance pay for departing ministers, although I am happy to review it, as I mentioned earlier. The current system respects the essential constitutional principles that ministers serve at the discretion of the Prime Minister, and that it is right to provide some protections associated with the loss of ministerial office. The principle has applied, as I said, to all governments since the Act was passed in 1991, and we need to be careful not to change policy on the basis of exceptions that will occasionally occur under governments of all different forms. I will indeed give way.
Giving way. If she's going to review this system, can she guarantee that it will be reviewed and implemented before the next general election?
I'm sad to say no, I can't, because what we've said, it is essential that it has due process on this floor of this House, not like the opposition who wants to whisk it through in a day. And we are completely transparent about the payments of severance, and all such payments are published in departmental annual reports. I will indeed.
In the interest of objective debate, could the Minister please confirm why ministers above the age of 65 from any of the major parties are less deserving than those who are under 65?
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and I think that would be looked at under the review as well, should we review this. But at the moment, the way the law was set out at the time, it stipulated that age. So that's something else that I agree would need to be looked at. But I also want to be clear, in a moment, I also want to be clear that severance pay cannot be looked at as a standalone issue. It is part of an overall picture that governs payments made to ministers. More broadly, the Government has consistently demonstrated restraint and has always sought to minimise the cost of government at the same time as modernising ministerial office to bring it into the 21st century. This is most clearly demonstrated in the Government's policy on ministerial pay. Ministerial salaries today are lower than they were when this government took office in 2010, which in real terms constitutes a significant pay cut. My right honourable friend, the Lord Cameron, introduced a 5% cut to ministerial pay when he came into office in 2010. Since then, Prime Ministers have asked ministers to waive the increase in their statutory pay entitlements year on year. For example, ministerial salaries are roughly half, that's half, of what it was if it had not been for Lord Cameron and the fact that he introduced that salary reduction when he became Prime Minister. So in April 2010, Ministers of State would earn £42,370. In today's money, that would mean they would be earning £63,594, and yet a minister today receives £31,680. So, I appreciate the Right Honourable Lady didn't want to reply to my friend's question. That was the Honourable Member for Southend West. So will the Right Honourable Lady confirm today that her party would continue with the ongoing cut in ministerial pay?
This is not what the motion's about, and I'm afraid I can't really help. I can ask her this, though. Is she aware that £2.9 million spent on severance payments in the same year, 22-23, for all the special advisers who had to lose their jobs?
I think we'll go back to the point, well dodged again by the Right Honourable Lady, that she won't actually confirm that they will keep a tight fiscal grip on ministerial pay, because obviously one of the key things today was about waste and expenditure. But they can't do that. We'll see what happens. As always, money runs away with the Labour Party. Now, in 2021, this government passed the Transformative Ministerial and Other Maternity Allowances Act, which for the first time enabled ministers to take paid maternity leave and be replaced in their departments. Several members have now benefited from this piece of legislation when in office, and I'm sure it will continue to be of immense value. The government is committed to returning to Parliament in due course to set out considerations and proposals on extending this to wider circumstances. So I want to conclude, Mr. Speaker, by reaffirming the government's commitment to recovering the money paid in error to a small number of former ministers, I want to reassure the House that departmental processes have been strengthened to ensure this error does not want to happen again. The Government does not, for the reasons I've set out, think whole-scale legislative reform should be done during this Parliament on this matter. We believe that a government committed to the principle of integrity in public life is the most effective way to control the cost of government to the taxpayer. In that spirit, we will continue to demonstrate restraint on how we are paid, and we will continue to modernise ministerial office to meet the expectations the public rightly have of us. But I have to say, the Right Honourable Lady who brought this debate today couldn't say if her party would maintain cuts to ministerial salaries that we've implemented, couldn't apologise for the last Labour government's wasting money on PFI schemes, couldn't say if this would be, because it's such an emergency and so important, the first piece of legislation in a Labour government, despite them claiming it was such an emergency. So we can safely conclude the Labour Party doesn't care about taxpayers' money.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank the Labour Party for bringing forward this motion. It really does serve to highlight the difference between this place and reality. Nearly £1 million in severance pay was handed out during last year's political chaos. Some ministers, Mr Deputy Speaker, received severance pay despite only being in office for 38 days. In a 38-day period, an asylum seeker would receive £47.96 if they're being housed in a hotel. This is enough to pay for first bus day tickets for 9 days, provided they buy nothing else during that period. In contrast, the former Chancellor would be able to pay for 3,309 bus day tickets, which is a full bus of day tickets for every one of those 38 days. And that's just from his severance pay. In clear and stark contrast, Scottish Government ministers have had a pay freeze for the 16th consecutive year. Currently, a Scottish Government minister is entitled to £99,516. That includes their MSP salary, by the way. But under a voluntary pay freeze, receives the 2008-9 level of £81,449. A Cabinet Secretary in Scotland has an entitlement of £118,511, but receives £96,999. The voluntary reduction is taken from net pay and is returned to the Scottish Government to be made available from public spending. This was mentioned by a number of members on the other side in relation to the freezes in ministerial pay here. According to the Library briefing, ministerial pay here has been frozen in the House of Commons at 2014 levels, but ministerial pay in the House of Lords has only been frozen at 2019 levels. So if the Government is going to appoint Cabinet Secretaries in the House of Lords, they in fact cost us more than Cabinet Secretaries do in the House of Commons. In terms of Cabinet Secretaries in Scotland and Scottish Government ministers, they are handing back each more money to public funds annually than the former Chancellor received in his severance pay. The Tories, Mr Deputy Speaker, are absolutely clear that people can live on universal credit, despite all evidence to the contrary. Yet the 38-day Chancellor accepted a severance payment worth nearly 4 years of universal credit for a single over 25. The UK Government seems determined at every opportunity to highlight how out of touch they are. They've refused to zero-rate VAT on mortgages. Yet, for 38 days' work, the member for Spelthorne accepted a payment that could cover 70 months. That's 5.5 years of the typical owner-occupier mortgage increase, according to the Bank of England. It is deeply, deeply ironic, Mr Deputy Speaker, that all homeowners are having to pay for his mistakes while he's being rewarded for them. As people are pushed into ever-increasing poverty and they're having to make devastating choices between heating and eating, the member for Spelthorne could fund 280 food parcels from his severance pay alone. And he's far from the only one. Tory and Brexit chaos has not just caused rampant inflation, it's not just increased the cost of mortgages, meaning that people are having to choose between heating and eating. It's meant government reshuffles every 5 minutes, with an IFG worker commenting, I'm not saying there's been a lot of ministerial turnover since 2010, but you could now play an 11-a-side football match between ministers for the Cabinet Office and Secretaries of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport during that time. The ministerial trough is institutional, and it's indicative of the rot ingrained in Westminster. The public rightfully deserve and expect value for money. Yet with record levels of turnover on the government benches, resulting in so many people eligible for severance payments, it is a ludicrous waste of public money during this cost of living crisis. In the 8 years since the Brexit vote, there have been 13 housing ministers, 9 education ministers, 8 home secretaries, 7 foreign secretaries, 7 chancellors, 7 health ministers, 7 DEFRA ministers, and 5 prime ministers. How is it possible, Mr Deputy Speaker, that former Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries was accidentally paid £17,000 in a severance payment? And the member for South West Norfolk served a pitiful 45 days as Prime Minister, crashed the UK economy with her fantasy think tank economics, and made the electorate, who did not vote for her, pay for her mistakes. Mr Deputy Speaker, Better Together said in 2014 that a no vote would bring better, safer, faster change for Scotland. Yet all we have seen in Westminster is constant chaos, mired in the ceaseless rot of corruption and cronyism. I would defy anyone to tell folk out there that their lives are better than they were before the independence referendum in 2014. Westminster is institutionally designed to promote the entrenchment of power and the passing of power between a few select hands while enriching the participants. Ministers are granted extremely broad powers with a lack of oversight by Parliament. We saw that once again yesterday during the course of the Finance Bill, where they can unilaterally change the Ways and Means resolutions after the debates have happened on the line-by-line scrutiny. We see that on a very regular basis. Taking back power was the call from the Brexiteers. They have taken back power to the executive, not to Parliament. Parliament is being stymied at every opportunity by this UK government. When ministers inevitably fail, or they're pushed out due to the political power games in Westminster, they then take ministerial severance payments. And after they're finally evicted from their seats by constituents, they can receive cushy money-for-nothing jobs in the Lords for the rest of their lives. And while ministers in Westminster abuse their positions to give contracts and public money to their friends and financial backers, these are not failings unique to the Tory party, but rather they're institutional design features of the Westminster system, which has inherited hundreds of years of aristocratic baggage and is entirely unfit as a system for governing a modern country. Labour has promised to reform Westminster from within for over 100 years, promising to abolish the House of Lords, promising to reduce prerogative ministerial powers, and now they're promising to reform ministerial severance pay. This promise is not worth the Hansard it is written in. Every time Labour is elected on a promise to reform Westminster, they instead integrate into the system, they dig in and use it for their own ends, stacking the Lords rather than abolishing it, or making extensive use of the prerogative powers rather than minimising them. When Labour takes power again, I have no doubt they will continue this long tradition of entrenchment. As the Leader of the Opposition continues his flip-flopping when he's possibly Prime Minister and not just Opposition Leader, he will doubtless lose, he will doubtless sack ministers. And when this happens, they will make just as much use of the ministerial severance pay as their Tory cousins. The only solution is a radical overhaul of Westminster, a radical overhaul of the entrenchment and the positions that there currently are. And only a vote for the SNP and independence will finally lead to the reforms necessary for Scotland and the rest of the UK to move forward and to become modern 21st century democracies that work for the people, that work for all the people and not just for overpaid politicians.
Yeah.
You're not giving way. Anna Firth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Well, if anyone had any doubt that the party opposite are not fit to govern this country, that doubt must be completely dispelled this afternoon. Of all the things they could have chosen, it's Children's Mental Health Week. There are all sorts of incredibly important things going on today about Internet Safety Day. It's the start of Apprenticeship Week. It was World Cancer Day 2 days ago. We have the economy. We have the Middle East. I've been to a brilliant debate, which I was PPSing today, on the Homes for Ukraine scheme. But no, they used their second opposition debate to talk about what is essentially party politics. That's all this is actually about. It's an appalling waste. It's an appalling waste of taxpayers' money that we are debating this today, because they know jolly well, and in fact the Right Honourable and learned lady has said this in her speech. The severance pay for ministers is established in legislation that was passed by this Parliament in 1991. It's been used by successive administrations over several decades. It's a statutory entitlement implemented by governments of all stripes. Payments have been made and accepted by outgoing Labour ministers throughout the Blair and the Brown years, as well as by Liberal Democrat ministers in the coalition. The last Labour government, of course I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Lady giving way. There's reference to the initial legislation, which is in 1991, but it was followed up, which she's no doubt aware, by the Scotland Act 1998, which was brought in by Labour and repeats the same approach for Scotland. Does she agree with me that this is the height of hypocrisy from the Labour government, that they claim outrage now when they brought in similar legislation themselves?
Agree with my honourable friend, and it's a brilliant point. It brings me naturally on to my next point, because the last Labour government had the opportunity to amend the 1991 legislation in any one of the 13 years that they were in office. Instead, they chose to do absolutely nothing. And what is more outrageous, following Labour's defeat in the 2010 election, when the honourable member for Birmingham Hodge Hill left that infamous note, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm sorry, I'm afraid to tell you there is no money left." I'm afraid to tell you there's no money left. The outcoming... What did he say? That's an exact quote. There's no money left. I mean, I don't mind saying it again, because that's the mess that the other side left us in. But the point here is, having said there is no money left, what did outgoing Labour ministers do? They pocketed £1 million in that year in severance pay. In today's money, it would be £1.6 million. I think that is truly shocking. I think that was irresponsible then, and I think their actions are 100% hypocritical today. And in stark contrast, and I have referred to this already, in stark contrast, when we entered office, what was our approach when we saw the mess that they'd left us in? We cut our ministerial salaries, and we've kept them frozen ever since.
Would the Honourable Lady give way?
I will give way again.
I'm so grateful for the Honourable Lady giving way. She makes an excellent point about Labour, but we have heard from the Scottish National Party that somehow it's better north of the border. Does she agree with me that it's surprising when the Scottish Daily Express says that spin doctors, and I quote, SNP spin doctors received more than £200,000 in, quotes, golden goodbyes in 2023 as Hamza Yusuf rung tiny changes? What does that say about them?
I totally agree with you. That's absolutely appalling. And of course, we also know that a shamed SNP MP, Derek McVey, who's left office, has claimed £155,000 in expenses, including, I understand, severance pay. So I think their whole approach is incredibly hypocritical. But what I was just coming on to say is that while we were sorting out their mess, cutting our own pay, keeping it frozen, every single Labour leadership candidate in 2010 refused to hand back their taxpayer-funded severance pay, including the Honourable Member for Doncaster North and the Mayor of Greater Manchester, both of whom were entitled to £20,000 and still hold elected office today. And when we questioned those severance payments, given the mess that they had left us in, a Labour Party spokesman responded that it was a pathetic attempt to create a smokescreen around serious economic issues. Yes, so I would be grateful if the front bench can confirm to the House today that this motion is a pathetic and hypocritical attempt to create a smokescreen around their total lack of plan for Britain. No plan for the economy, no plan to tackle welfare, no plan to deal with immigration. And in fact, we know they would take us right back to square one. As usual, while the other side are sniping from the sidelines and making these cheap political points, we are actually getting on with the job of serious government. In the last 14 years, the Conservative Party has been focusing on delivering for the people of Britain. And I'd just like to remind them of what that delivery looks like. Better state schools than ever before. More students securing top grades in maths, physics and chemistry. I'm not far from finished, so I'm going to carry on. More students from state schools at our best universities, skyrocketing up the PISA tables, the best readers now in the Western world. Record employment. 4 million people now in a job than in 2010. That's over 800 jobs every day. No, I won't if you don't mind. I'm going to finish. A national living wage. Welfare simpler, fairer and better targeted, more hours of free childcare, the largest single expansion in childcare in English history, the fastest decarbonisation of any major economy, leading the way in the renewables, which will be key to our future. Mr. Speaker, I could go on and on. This is a record that we are extremely proud of on this side, and it's because we stuck to our plan. We've halved inflation, we've cut taxes for 27 million working people, worth £450 starting last week for an average worker, and of course we continue to support the most vulnerable in society, keeping the triple lock, doubling the personal allowance. So I will now conclude, Mr. Speaker, because any review of the long-standing ministerial arrangements for severance pay should be done properly, with due process. It should not be done in this desperate and political fashion. We are delivering for the people of Britain. The party on the other side would just take us straight back to square one.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, I think the best that can be said for the previous speaker was 6 minutes 50 seconds speaking on anything but the motion, and then the last 10 seconds on severance pay. Now, Mr Deputy, I'm sure other than that, she is a delightful member of this House, and but on this occasion, I'm afraid she didn't really get there. In supporting the motion today, I want to highlight a trio of payments that were made during the chaotic period in the autumn of 2022, which capture the essence of why the rules around ministerial severance were brought into disrepute during that period, and also how these reforms could fix the problem. It's impossible to make these points without speaking about individual cases, as my right honourable friend said from the front bench. And I've informed two members that I will be discussing the payments given to them as examples of what happened. Now, if we cast our minds back to September 2022, colleagues will remember that in the early days of the premiership of the right honourable member for South West Norfolk, there was some turmoil in her whips operation. Mind you, the early days were swiftly followed by the middle days, and the final days were not very far behind, and it's fair to say there was turmoil all the way through. Anyway, in those early days, 3 assistant whips were sacked and 3 more were put in their place. The appointments were made 3 days before the mini-budget, and the appointments lasted just 38 days until the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk left Downing Street. The 3 assistant whips spent almost their entire time in office propping up a doomed regime, while it continued to do huge damage to the country. Damage for which my constituents are still paying the price in the shape of crippling mortgage payments. In those circumstances, you might have thought that those who were appointed by the member for South West Norfolk would have walked away from their brief time in office feeling some measure of contrition, perhaps even shame, at the role that they had played in that disastrous administration, wanting only to apologise to their constituents for what they had done. Instead, unbelievably, each of the 3 assistant whips walked away with 3 months of severance pay, a £4,479 handout from the taxpayer, after just 38 days' work. They received 2.5 times more in severance pay than they were paid in salaries during those 38 days. At the same time, a number of departmental ministers received £5,593 in severance pay compared to their salaries of £2,248 for their 5 and a bit weeks as ministers. And all this time at a time when people all around the country were struggling to put food on the table, to fill up their cars and to pay their bills in the face of a cost of living crisis, which these ministers' times in office had just made substantially worse. Average growth in the UK has been 1.5% compared to the 2% when Labour were in office between 1997 and 2010. And that lower growth has meant £150 billion less in GDP, £40 billion less in tax revenues for public services and infrastructure, and £10,000 a year less on average for each household for each of those years across the UK. Those are the figures, the price of failure of the 14 years of Conservative government. And when the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk crashed the economy through her reckless, unfunded mini-budget, it just charged the damage done. My constituents, and all our constituents, are still living with the consequences of what the then Chancellor, the member for Spelthorne, dismissively referred to as turbulence. And that's through the higher food prices and those mortgage payments. The premium for economic failure, which was created when the members for South West Norfolk and for Spelthorne crashed the economy, is still priced into markets today. And private investment in the UK is still at a record low. The scale of severance payments as a reward for being part of this disastrous mismanagement of the economy is nothing short of disgraceful. But if it serves one purpose, it does at least make the case for reform indisputable. It is a shame that the Minister chose not to engage with the substantive point that the severance payment system has been shown not to be fit for purpose as a result of what happened in 2022. Now, under Labour's proposals, the 3 assistant whips would have received not a quarter of their annual salary, but a quarter of their actual earnings, reducing their severance payments from £4,479 to £454, almost a tenth of what they originally received, and a much fairer and more sensible amount. Now, the member for Southport has been at pains to point out in recent days, in his comments to the Liverpool Echo, that the payment he received was an automatic entitlement. In other words, he was just following the rules as they currently stand. The £4,479 he received, compared to the £454 that would have been due, had the legislation referred to on today's order paper been in place, really does say it all. And the member for South Ribble made a similar defence in the Lancashire Post and was quoted as saying that severance payments are governed by Act of Parliament. Our proposal would have seen her severance payment down from £5,593 to £562, much more proportionate to her time served. Now, I am more than happy to accept what both of them have said in public, but I just hope that they accept that in no other job would the level of severance from which they benefited, severance payment from which they benefited, be allowed. And among the questions that were really not addressed by the Minister, I would say this. In what other job is full severance pay available from day one in this way? And in what other job is severance pay available in the event of gross misconduct? These are the reasons why what my right honourable friend has proposed from the front bench today are so important. Now, the good news, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that members opposite, including those beneficiaries of excessive payments, have an opportunity to make amends today.
I think he's making a very interesting point, actually, there. And I want to explore it a little bit more, or ask the honourable member to explore it a bit more, because on the face of the motion, the immediate availability of redundancy payment, if I can call it that, is not affected by this motion. So does he suggest that this motion isn't fit for purpose either?
Good question.
Well, it sounded again to me like he was defending the status quo, when all we're actually trying to do is make it proportionate and fair. But as I say, Mr Deputy Speaker, he and his colleagues will have a chance to do something about this unfair system that has been shown to be completely out of order by what happened in 2022. And those who took advantage of the rules can do something about it by voting with us tonight. Now, this is because, to use the words of the member for Southport, rules could be changed. And to use the words of the member for South Ribble, Acts of Parliament can also be replaced. So this evening, all of those members who benefited from severance payments when the member for South West Norfolk resigned can do something about the excessive nature of some of those payments. They can take advantage of the opportunity we're offering, and they can take the logical step and vote to change the rules by supporting Labour's proposal for a fair, more proportionate severance payment system for ministers.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I start immediately by making a disclosure to this House, which of course is in the public domain and has been for some time, that I have received a severance pay in the past. So that is something I want to make clear from the outset. And can I also make clear from the outset that in my respectful view, some of the ad hominem attacks that we've heard about named members of Parliament, I don't think, my personal view is that those sorts of attacks actually damage the institution of politics. They don't work in a partisan way. Those individuals did not do anything wrong. They were part of a system that allocated that funding to them. So there should be no legal or moral opprobrium attached to them in their absence, whether they've been notified about that or not. It's fine to say that the system ought to change, but surely it isn't fair to criticise people for being subject to a system that has not been changed. So I make that point at the outset. But as I say, I received a severance pay, but I served in government roles of one sort or another for over 10 years, if one includes non-ministerial positions. In terms of ministerial positions, I served as Deputy Leader of the House of Commons, as Minister for the Arts, as Minister for Transport, as Solicitor General, Attorney General for the first time under one Prime Minister, Paymaster General, Minister for the Cabinet Office, and Attorney General for the second time under a second Prime Minister. In fact, I served under 4 Prime Ministers in one role or another, and in Cabinet on 3 occasions. Should I not receive a severance pay? And the Honourable Gentleman says, where else would this happen in the outside world? Well, where else in the outside world would we have a situation where there are no redundancy arrangements, there are no notice periods, there's no contract between the parties, there are no consultations and those employees, if they were employees, could be removed without cause. In a moment, if I may, just finish this train of thought. So I'm not criticising those things. That's the way government works, and ministers take on those roles knowing exactly that that's the position. So they shouldn't criticise that. That's the way the cookie crumbles. If you don't like it, don't take the position. But what I do say is there's no point comparing chalk and cheese. The system operates in a different way from the outside world. We have a situation, a constitutional situation, where the Prime Minister, whether he be Labour or she be Labour or Conservative, has to have the right of hiring and firing his or her ministerial team. That is an essential prerequisite of the role. I'll just finish this train of thought. It's an essential prerequisite of the role. And the way it must work, the only way it could work, is by giving that Prime Minister that primus inter pares role where he or she has that function. I'll give way.
Right, honourable member, and ministers should get severance pay, as he served, as he said, and indeed so did I, as a minister, and that is absolutely right. But this motion doesn't actually suggest that. He was a former deputy leader of the House. Does he think it's right that a deputy leader of the House who served for 81 days should receive 3 months severance pay? That's the question, really, that we're debating today, not the general principle, which I agree with him, and I think this side of the House does agree with him, that there should be appropriate severance pay because of exactly the reasons he's given.
When one has a system in law, whether it is a system that has been created 30 years ago or 10 years ago or 100 years ago, that must apply to all. And if the system falls out of favour, then that can be reviewed. But he criticises an example of someone who was entitled to take a severance payment and who served in that role. Now, the last Labour government, as he alludes to himself, received these payments, and in fact they received payments that were actually statistically more generous than have been the case under this government. £1.6 million in real terms in today's prices. And as has already been said, Mr Deputy Speaker, all 4 Labour leadership candidates in 2010 didn't return their pay, and I think they were under their severance pay. I think they were under some pressure at the time to do so, and they declined to do so. I think that, yes, indeed, and I think it is necessary to bear in mind that when people have no contract, no notice period, no consultation or redundancy arrangements, and where ministers can be removed without cause, then it is right that that is differentiated from what happens elsewhere, because there is an increased risk, and I will give way.
I think the member's making an interesting point. If working conditions are so poor, can I suggest he joins a trade union?
I'm a member of a trade union. Actually, I'm not, but but he didn't know that. But actually, let's mention trade unions, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because this motion is rather alien to the concept of what I understand trade union organisations actually work to do. I mean, they would be appalled, I think, at this motion, because they would say about their own members, and I've always considered, by the way, as a lawyer, I've always considered that trade union organisations are very robust in defending their members and their legal rights, very robust, and throw the kitchen sink at it if they think the case is appropriate, in terms of the best quality lawyers and the best quality legal advice. And that's how they represent their members. But I think they'd be appalled by this motion, because they would say this is contrary to the ethos of how trade unions work. So, but if you look at trade unions, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it was they that used to support Labour, and still do, but in the 1890s and 1900s, when Parliament did not pay MPs' salaries, it was because of trade unions that early Labour and before that Liberal members of Parliament could afford to be here at all. Because in those days, prior to 1911, if I'm not mistaken, members of Parliament were not paid at all. And when they started to be paid in 1911, they were paid £400 a year at a time when the average salary in this country was £70 a year. But Labour then argued that that was right and proper that those salaries should be started, because then everyone could afford to become a Member of Parliament. But what we have to remember, and what I encourage the Labour front bench to remember now, is that that argument is inconsistent with today's argument, because what they would be arguing for is that only wealthy people would consider becoming ministers. And Labour ministers were earning double what ministers have earned under the Conservative government since 2010, because the Right Honourable Lord Cameron, my noble friend, froze ministerial salaries, and they've stayed frozen since the 2010 Parliament, and that means that that has been a major impact. What is also worth noting, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that Labour Select Committee chairs, the chairman and chairwomen of Labour of select committees, and senior Labour MPs who are on the Speaker's panel have also taken salary increases during the course of the tenure of these parliaments. So I would suggest that that is also inconsistent with the thrust of the Labour front bench argument, because if they think that it's too much for one, they should say it's too much for all. So I think there are some significant inconsistencies, and we must bear in mind that we have to serve the public in the best way we can, and that means encouraging people to come to this place, to serve in this place, and to do their duty. And I think that ministers of the Crown, and in fact members of Parliament from across the political divide, do come here with a view to doing that, and that's why I disagree with this motion.
Thank you very much. Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And when I saw the amounts that were being talked about in this debate, I couldn't help but think about an organisation which does brilliant work in my constituency called Haringey Giving, which is set up and managed by residents. And it allows various groups to make applications to it. In the 5 years that Haringey Giving has been operating, they proudly boast that they've been able to support 136 local grassroots organisations and help thousands of people in the community through the provision of £900,000 of funding. £900,000 of funding painstakingly raised and distributed over 5 years, and it's still not the same amount that this government was able to spend on severance payments in the single year of 2022 to 2023. And I notice when I've been door knocking, and in recent times doing rather a lot of it, in really interesting parts of the country. And one thing that people have fed back to me is chop and change. People don't like chop and change. And what this motion does today, really, it's not a critique, as the member before me mentioned, about salaries for doing political work, such as being an MP in general. It's criticising the chop and change of this government, of the various governments since 2019. This Christmas just gone, Haringey Giving held their annual fundraising drive, with local residents and businesses all playing their part. We managed to raise £17,000. £17,000, about the average amount received by the 20 cabinet ministers who claimed severance payments in 2022 to 2023. In fact, the member for Great Yarmouth, who many have quoted in today's debate, could have kept one of his severance payments and donated the other to Haringey Giving. And if he's listening to the debate, he still has a chance to do that. And it would have been double the total that they raised in December. And I say this, Mr Deputy Speaker, because it's the difference between the real world and the lives of so many of our constituents. Because when we talk about these severance payments, I think it's vital to remember exactly what is happening in the country as a whole. When at advice surgeries, families come to the advice surgery, a child has no teeth, stubs for teeth because there have been no dental appointments, or a family that I have heard from who have had a pair of shoes. One child wears them to the sixth form one day, and then that pair of shoes is available later on for the weekend for another child to use to do a part-time job. This is the sort of child poverty that we are talking about. The headline 12-month inflation rate started the year at 9% and ended the year at 10%, peaked at 11% in October 2022, the month in which 38 ministers claimed severance payments. Food prices rose especially fast, with ordinary families facing a 19% increase in the cost of their weekly shop from March 2022 to March 2023. These amounts of money really matter because they buy things like food and shoes, and they should not be going into the pockets of ministers who have failed and who have been through the revolving doors and become ministers again. The average pump price for petrol and diesel hit an all-time high, with petrol rising to £1.91 per litre in the last week of June 2022, and diesel hitting almost £2 per litre in the first week of July 2022, the same week that 21 ministers claimed severance payments after joining the coup against Boris Johnson. And of course we then have mortgage payments. The Bank of England base rate started the year at April 2022 at 0.75% and ended the year in March 2023 at 4.25%, with the biggest spike taking place in the wake of the kamikaze budget. Millions of households saw their mortgages rates soar, and millions more have felt the pain since, as their fixed-rate deals have come to an end, that pain has been made all the much worse thanks to the direct actions of the government. So there we have it, 2022-23, a year when families across the country were struggling more than ever in the face of the cost of living crisis, struggling to put food on the table, struggling to fill up their cars, struggling to pay their mortgages, keep a roof over their heads, facing impossible choices and having to make incredible sacrifices. And that is without mentioning the record peacetime tax burden the government has also imposed on the country during that period. And what was the Tory party doing while all this was going on? Fighting with each other, scrabbling around for promotions, pay rises, severance payments and resignation honours like they were prizes in a game show. During that disastrous year for the country, their only priority was looking after their own backs and filling their own boots. I hope this evening they will think about their constituents struggling to make ends meet, to all the charities in our constituents who work for every penny that they raise. Think about people at the Haringey Living Scheme, scraping and striving to raise a few £1,000s. Show a bit of contrition and vote to let these reforms proceed. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much. Jerome Mayhew.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's been an absolutely fascinating debate, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for proposing this motion, because it has given us an opportunity to explore what responsible government really is. But I'll tell you what it isn't, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is not about creating one-paragraph legislation in order to get a soundbite in this evening's news. And you only have to listen to the debate that we've had to see how the current drafting of this motion is totally inappropriate, because it only makes one recommendation. It says that ministers should receive an amount equal to 1/4 of their earnings over the previous 12 months as a minister, minus any period covered by a previous severance entitlement, where that is lower than an amount equal to 1/4 of the annual salary paid to that minister before their departure. But that only applies to those ministers or retiring ministers who are under the age of 65. And yet, just in this empty chamber, relatively empty chamber, we have heard several suggestions as to why that is inappropriate. It's either not going far enough, or it's missing out important additions. Because, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think this is a serious issue. I think this is an area that could do with review. In fact, it was from the front bench. The Right Honourable Member for Tatton suggested that the government is open to review of this issue. But this is absolutely not the right way to do it, as this debate has demonstrated. Just look at the contribution from the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town. He quite fairly raised the issue of prime ministerial pension or severance payment, which continues beyond the moment of retirement. It's not just a one-off payment, but it continues for the rest of his or her life, as I understand it. That is a perfectly proper area for review. It's not mentioned in this motion. And the Honourable Member for Sefton Central, he made a very good point, and I did intervene on him at the time, that there was the entitlement comes from day one. And we've got is that reasonable? What about the point made by the Honourable Member for, my Honourable friend, the Member for Bracknell, where he recognised that there's a contradiction here, is there not? That these severance payments are entitled for those people under the age of 65, but times have moved on. We work much later. The retirement age itself is raising to 67 and then to 68, and there was an article in the Times just yesterday suggesting that it might rise in future years to the age of 71. And yet the legislation, it has this arbitrary figure of 65. Why? That is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a perfectly reasonable area to explore as part of a wider review of a piece of legislation which perhaps does come towards the end of its natural life, and it does need to be reviewed. But this isn't the way to do it. This drafting that Labour cobbled together last night, when they were thinking, what's the good wheeze we can have? What's the good wheeze that we can create a soundbite or with a bit of a luck, a line in our social media content this evening saying, Conservatives vote against ... That's not legislation. And it's particularly inappropriate in my submission, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to use the exceptional mechanism of disapplying Standing Order 14 in order to achieve it. Now, there are many benefits of Brexit, but one of the costs of Brexit, in my view, is the adoption of this mechanism to interrupt the workings of Parliament by disapplying Standing Order 14. And if it's acceptable in any situation, it's in exceptional and urgent situations that disapplication should take place, not in order to get a soundbite. I will give way, but it's not in order to get a soundbite for this evening's news.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. And I don't think that I stand before you today to say that this motion is going to, and this legislation is going to fix every single issue that you can possibly think of in relation to the payment of members of Parliament in every circumstance. But it will at least deal with a situation whereby you could work for 2 months as a minister, get 3 months severance pay, and then 7 weeks later go back to exactly the same job and to be essentially paid twice. I mean, that's what this legislation is here to stop. Surely he can support that.
I'm grateful for the intervention. As I said at the start of my speech, there are elements where I think there is genuine cause for review. But if you follow the Right Honourable Lady's train of thought, we would have thousands, literally thousands of one-paragraph acts clogging up the legislation. We need to do better than that. The responsible government, which is what we try and focus on this side of the House, we review appropriately, we use advice from civil servants, and then we apply we put forward proposed legislation. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is a much wider issue here. It's not just on the poverty of the drafting which Labour has put forward for the division today, but there's the wider issue of ministerial pay. There's the wider issue of value for money. Because as has already been pointed out by the very good speech, in my view, of my honourable friend, the member for Southend West, in 2010, when the Conservatives came to power as part of the coalition, it wasn't a case of just accepting what had gone before. The government, under the leadership of the then Prime Minister David Cameron, cut ministerial salaries by 5%, and more importantly, has every single year since then, throughout the coalition period and then through the Conservative government period, has frozen ministerial salaries. So let's look at the value for money, the difference that you get between a Labour administration and a Conservative one. If you're a whip, there's the honourable member, the Labour whip, sitting in his place there. In 2010, under Labour, he would have benefited from a salary of £40,926. I can see the honourable... Yeah. Under the Conservatives, that equivalent position, if he were in government, the equivalent position receives a salary of £17,917. As a parliamentary Under Secretary of State, Labour paid themselves £48,270 in addition to their parliamentary salary. Under the Conservatives, that has been reduced in modern terms to £22,375. The Minister of State, at Minister of State level, under the Conservatives, they're paid £31,680. Under Labour, they paid themselves the equivalent of £63,594. No trouble with their mortgage payments, you might... And then, as a Cabinet Minister, Mr Deputy Speaker, under the Conservatives, they're paid an additional £67,505. Labour thought it appropriate to pay themselves £122,598. We've already heard in the speeches previously that the Right Honourable Member for Birmingham Hodge Hill said that there was no money left. Well, now I'm beginning to understand where it all went. And then we move to the Prime Minister, the position of the Prime Minister. This Prime Minister is paid an additional £75,440. Labour paid themselves, think it's appropriate to pay themselves £204,329 in today's money on top. Then add to that Sir Keir Starmer, well, the Right Honourable Member for St Pancras' Special Pension Act, where he had his own personal pension arrangements as he, in his work as the Director of Public Prosecutions, disapplying any lifetime allowance for him, and then not for anyone else. So you add that together, you've got £204,329 as Prime Minister, if he were ever to be one, his MP's salary of £86,584, plus his special pension arrangements. It's no wonder he votes Labour, Mr Deputy Prime Minister. He can afford to be a socialist. The question for Labour is, will they commit today to continue the freeze of ministerial salaries? The Right Honourable lady on the front bench was asked that very question by my honourable friend, the member for Southend West. She was unable to answer it, so I gave her the opportunity to answer it again. She refused to. Perhaps in her final comments, or perhaps she could write to me if she doesn't know the answer. Why can she not commit to that? Yes, I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, because he's making an absolutely brilliant speech this afternoon. But he absolutely is. And I wonder if he'd like to comment on something which he started to comment on earlier. The road of Damascus conversion on the other side. This sudden desire to tackle something that they had 13 long years to tackle. And not only did they not tackle it, they went on to add to the system.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. It was mentioned in somebody's speech, once if not twice earlier on today, that in 2010, the former candidates for the leader of the Labour Party were invited to return their severance payments since they refused to. And it was, on behalf of the Labour Party, I think the suggestion that they should return those payments was described as being pathetic. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, this motion is by any view half-baked. We've seen just in the course of a couple of hours a number of interesting suggestions which could apply to potential legislation in this event. It's clearly an improper use of the disapplication of Standing Order 14. And look at it. Here we are. If it's such an emergency, why are Labour benches so bare? Because even Labour members of Parliament do not think that this is an urgent issue. I have no hesitation in voting against this, and I invite everyone else to do the same.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Broadland in this debate, which I have to take issue with the right honourable member for Tatton. Is important. Yeah. Is actually an opportunity, which I thank the Labour Party for. When I say it's an opportunity, I don't mean it's an opportunity to throw criticisms at those ministers who were sacked. I think it was 147 of them in 1 year. It's not an opportunity to criticise them because, as the Right Honourable Member for Islington South and Finsbury pointed out, a lot of them did actually hand back the money that they were given. It's not an opportunity either to throw brickbats at the Labour Party and say, well, you didn't do this while you were in government and you think this about ministerial salaries. It's actually, above all else, an opportunity to say to the constituents out there who come to us every week struggling to pay their mortgages, their rents, who've been made redundant, and who don't have another job with another salary that they can fall back on when they get the redundancy payment. To say to them that actually we appreciate what's happening, this was a terrible period for the country, It was chaotic. It cost a fortune. And actually, we're going to look at preventing it ever happening again. That's what today should be about. It should be about putting ourselves in their place and thinking what they might be thinking, watching this debate right now. And I have to say, I'm acutely aware that my constituents are probably watching it and saying to themselves what quite a few people have said to me over the years, and I'm sure have said to many other members here, that too many of us are only in it to line our own pockets. Because we've sat here today and listened to a debate when we've talked about redundancies for ministers and complained about ministerial salaries. In a country that's facing a cost of living crisis, when people can't pay their energy bills. Now, I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm taking a school marriage attitude to this, but I am slightly embarrassed that any one of us could think that this is not something that we should be reviewing. Certainly.
I'm grateful for her allowing the intervention. I think she does make some powerful points, as I hope I made clear in my speech. But given her views about the cost of living crisis, does she agree that the freeze on ministerial salaries should be maintained into the future?
I'm actually more concerned with the fact that this is about redundancy payments. The level of ministerial salaries is something which should be debated on its own and should be the subject of review regularly. But what pains me is that I have constituents who, when they're made redundant and they get the statutory minimum, have nothing to fall back on. When ministers are sacked for incompetence, they have the salary for the job that they're actually sent here to do, which is to serve as a Member of Parliament. To have the privilege of serving as a Member of Parliament. They then get paid more for the extra privilege of being a minister. And I actually think a lot of the public will be watching this today saying they get a salary for being a minister. They get redundancy payments for being a minister. So I think we need to think about this very, very seriously. And we need to think about what our constituents will be thinking. And I don't want to throw bric-a-bracs at individuals. But just to take one, very, very briefly. When the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk resigned as Prime Minister, her golden goodbye was more than the minimum salary in this country. It would have gone a long way for a lot of families. And we should be thinking about what those families think about that. Not what we think about it, not whether we think the Labour Party are wrong or the Conservative Party are wrong or the SNP, and frankly I don't think we should be taking any lectures on financial probity from them. But we should be thinking about what our constituents think, because for many of them that would have felt like a kick in the teeth. They couldn't pay their mortgage, they were struggling to pay their children, and they see in their eyes, not my judgment, their eyes, dozens of Conservative MPs raking in thousands of pounds in severance pay, completely down to the government chaos that they had caused during a cost of living crisis. And it would have felt to them like they were having to pay for the revolving door of government ministers, taxpayers' money paying for that. The Conservatives, in their view, and in mine actually, trashed the economy. And then they would have felt that they were picking up the price tag for that. They were paying for it. That is why I think these payouts have to be stopped. I completely respect the members who gave back the payments. I think that was the right thing to do, and we should recognise that. But we also have to recognise it should be stopped, because the current legislation, as has been said several times today, was introduced in 1991, but could have taken no account of the sort of situation that we were going to see in 2022 and 2023, because it's beyond anyone's imagination that such a situation would have arisen. And the fact is, we didn't take account of it when it happened. And that is where I think today gives us an opportunity to rectify that. We have an opportunity to say this was a unique set of circumstances. that the 1991 legislation didn't foresee. And yes, we can have a review, and yes, we can look at it, but we need to recognise that when thousands, millions of families in this country were at their lowest point, they were looking at the television and seeing ministers who'd worked for a few days, been sacked for incompetence or for falling out with their boss, getting more money, more thousands of pounds, when they were getting nothing. So my party, the Liberal Democrats, do have proposals. We think there should be a major overhaul of ministerial severance pay, and that MPs who resigned for breaking the ministerial code in particular should not be able to claim severance pay, and that ministers have to serve in post for a reasonable period of time, and that payouts can't be claimed if they are reappointed to the government within a year. I don't think any of that's unreasonable. And I think more than anything else, it would give us the opportunity to go out there and be able to look our constituents in the face and say, no, we're not in it to line our own pockets. And we're not going to take anything that we don't deserve. And we're not going to take for granted the privilege of being here and expect more than they would think that we deserve.
Ellis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. If damaging the economy and people's living standards, as well as degrading our health service, councils and other public services, was not enough for this government, so they have also enriched themselves and cost the taxpayer close, as we've heard, to £1 million as a result of their sheer incompetence and infighting. We found out that ministers, some of whom, as we've heard, have only been in post for a matter of weeks, some facing serious accusations and others ineligible or through age, have received handsome sums of taxpayers' money. So the question on my lips, and no doubt the lips of many of our constituents, is why are ministers given such special treatment? One day, just one day in post as a Cabinet Minister entitles an individual to £16,876 as a severance payment. One day in the job for a Minister of State is £7,920. And if it's a Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, one day gets you £5,594. These are vast sums of money, taxpayers' money, available only to a select few and come with absolutely no caveats for performance, conduct or indeed length of service. So let me be clear, we don't disagree with the principle of having loss of office payments to ministers. Ministers, like all workers, should be entitled to some form of payment in the event of suddenly losing their job on income through no fault of their own. Although I suspect many of my constituents will actually not have much sympathy with that proposition, given those in this position will still have their MP salary to fall back on, and indeed we know from other members other sources of income, and those salaries of course are well in excess of what most of our constituents earn. Being a minister, I'm sure, isn't easy, but this should not detract from the fundamental issue that those in governmental positions are given completely different treatment to the wider public, even different treatment to the members of the public working in the very same departments that those ministers serve. Yes.
Yes. One person who can't fall back on their MP salary is, of course, Peter Bone, who was the deputy leader of the House for 81 days and received a redundancy payment, even though he's over 65, of £5,593. Now, obviously, he's no longer the MP for Wellingborough, but shouldn't we be told whether or not that money has been paid back by Peter Bone, given, not least given, that there's going to be a by-election in a few days' time in that constituency?
Well, friend, for that point, it's a very, very good point. I'm sure his former constituents, many of whom will have had calls from the DWP when benefits overpayments have been made, and they have absolutely had to pay those back, would expect him to have done exactly the same. It's clearly a matter of public interest.
Would he accept another
I certainly will.
Would he accept my view that people who just may have £1,000 just to make a bet on anything may be a bit out of touch with how most people live their lives in this day and age?
Thank my honourable friend for her intervention. Yes, I think anyone who can afford to wager that kind of money on anything, never mind something as important as matters of national public policy, really doesn't experience the lives most of our constituents have. So in the 22-23 financial year, there were 4 ministers who left office after facing allegations of misconduct. all for breaching the Ministerial Code. 2 received a full severance payment, 1 selected a reduced payout, and another turned it down altogether. But regardless of the circumstances of their dismissal, they were entitled to those payments as of right. In all those forced out of position while facing allegations of misconduct or falling below the expected standards, they were entitled to payments totalling tens of thousands of pounds. That only half of them took it is immaterial. It is the principle that those individuals were given a choice and had an entitlement that anyone outside government does not have access to. In any other workplace, an employee who has gross misconduct allegations against them upheld would surely expect to be dismissed immediately without pay. Likewise, if they'd found to be acting in a way that was below the standards expected of them, they would be liable to dismissal with no automatic right to compensation. So in the real world, when dismissed for reasons other than gross misconduct, the only protection offered to employees is a statutory notice period, which that employee actually still has to work. Ministers don't have to work their notice periods. This notice period is actually just 1 week until an employee has 2 years' service. In stark contrast, ministers have from day one, minute one, an automatic entitlement to a quarter of their salary without even having to work any notice period whatsoever. That's day one rights that most people can only dream of having. And the evidence is clear that when you look at the eye-watering sums ministers have gobbled up, in some cases just a matter of weeks' service to qualify for it, our analysis has found that in total 57 ministers are in post for less than 3 months before taking their ministerial severance payments. Put another way, they are able to cash in on their party's chaos and receive more money in severance pay than they actually earned doing the job in the first place. And I'm actually going to say that again because I find it absolutely staggering. 57 government ministers got paid more for leaving the job than they got paid for actually doing it. That absolutely sums up what a shambles the last few years has been. But it doesn't end there, though. There are now 9 former ministers who spent a grand total of just 37 days as a minister in their whole career, all within that 44-day disastrous lettuce premiership, which we are still feeling the effects of. But when they were effectively sacked by the current Prime Minister, they were all allowed to pocket sums of £5,593, which is not far off 3 times the amount of money they actually earned doing the job. So a government that hit the pockets of millions of Britons with its unfunded tax cuts also hit the public purse with these giveaways. And when we look at what happens in the real world, we know that thanks to this government's lack of regard for workers' rights, you have to be in a job for 2 years before you get any kind of compensation. That is an outrageously long period of time, and for ordinary people after 2 full years of continuous service, the redundancy payment is very modest in comparison to what ministers can expect. Depending on the age of the individual, it would require between 8 and 12 years of continuous service before they would be entitled to the 12 weeks redundancy pay, which is the equivalent of what ministers are automatically entitled to no matter how long they have served. That ministers who have served for matters of weeks were able to claim a level of payment that those reliant on statutory protections would take up to 12 years to accrue is galling. And let's not forget, if this is your only wage, and the commitments that are made off the back of it are of course likely to be substantial, which means the sense of jeopardy if things go wrong is palpable, the consequences of failure are real. But the deal offered to ministers who are effectively made redundant has none of those strings attached. I think it is abundantly clear that the generosity of the 1991 Act has been tested beyond breaking point over the course of the 2 previous years. I cannot believe that when the major government introduced this Act, they ever thought we would have such a rapid turnover of ministers. After all, it is hardly the basis for good government. But as we know, there are many conventions that have been tested to the limit in recent years. Indeed, the condition in the rules that an outgoing minister can only receive the payment if they do not return to government within 3 weeks was probably seen when it was introduced as being an extremely unlikely scenario. After all, ministerial appointments are not meant to be a carousel, yet we now know that 20 ministers decided to take and keep their severance payments, despite the fact they found themselves returning to government within 3 months of their initial departure, and some returned even quicker than that. It just shows how much the Tories love fire and rehire, except in the real world, the worker doesn't become thousands of pounds better off as a result of it. And maybe it is that the government ministers think everyone gets thousands of pounds for no reason when fire and rehire occurs to ordinary people. And that, I think, is the only explanation as to why they allow that outrageous practice to continue. But this money merry-go-round is self-evidently against the spirit of the loss of office system and the original Act. The severance payment is designed to help an individual financially transition having been in government, not to effectively be a bonus for ministers temporarily out of the fray. The rules simply could not have foreseen the level of chaos that the last government has subjected us to. And it's hard to escape the feeling that there is a profound injustice with the system and the way in which it was exploited in 2022. Almost £1 million of public money was handed out in the form of severance payments that year. A figure that, had the reforms we are proposing today been introduced, would have reduced that by 40% to just over £550,000. So I return to the question, what makes a minister so special? Is a couple of weeks being a minister equivalent to 8 or even 12 years service that our constituents would have to work to get the same level of payment? I think we can all agree that that shouldn't be the case. This just isn't about levelling down ministers' payments. It's actually about improving workers' rights, and our new deal for working people will transform working conditions for everyone around the country. I do want to make one other point, Mr Deputy Speaker, which I think is very important, which is actually about the lack of transparency on these payments. My humble friend from Cardiff has already made the point about the former member for Wellingborough and his payment. And I accept that it's been the case for many years. We only find out when payments have been made by a particular department when a department publishes its annual report for the preceding financial year. But they're not required to do that until the 31st of January in the subsequent financial year. So anyone who's recently filled out their self-assessment tax return will note that annual reports work on exactly the same timetable by 31st of January, and you must report by then on what your financial situation was at the end of March in the previous year. Although I suspect government departments don't have the frustrations that my constituents do in waiting hours on end to speak to someone on the end of an HMRC helpline. But the reason why we're only debating today the final severance bill of £933,000 is because we only learned about the final group of payments last week when the Department of Health and Social Care published its report, adding another £41,000 to the total. But what it also means is that we're 8 weeks away from the end of the 2023-24 financial year, and we do not know yet whether a single severance payment has been claimed by any of the ministers who left their jobs in that year. As we know, several cabinet ministers have had to resign in disgrace or were sacked, and we do not know whether their bad behaviour was rewarded in the way other ministers' payments actions have been. What we do know is that the last reshuffle in November of 2023 created a theoretical severance entitlement of £112,000. Again, we don't know how much of that was claimed or by whom. And here is the crucial thing. As things stand, we're not entitled under law to be told any of the answers to these questions until the 31st of January 2025, which of course is beyond the final date when a general election must be held. In other words, a number of former ministers will be standing for re-election, but taxpayers will not have the right to know what severance payments they've received over the previous year. So if we can't even have transparency, we ought to at least have some reform. So I'll conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, by saying that the frequency of reshuffles in the last few years have taken the idea of government instability to a new level, a level that frankly makes a mockery of us all. And when that absurdity not only doesn't see any negative consequences for those in charge, but actually sees them rewarded for their misdemeanours, it is little wonder that so many of the public look at this place and think it is inhabited by people totally out of touch with reality. Losing your job as a government minister has none of the risk attached to it that many of our constituents face every day, be it the uncertainty of not knowing whether they will be given enough hours next week to put food on the table because they are on a 0 hours contract, be it the risk that because they are in bogus self-employment, they have no comeback if they have a dispute with the company, or be it that they have to be in their job for 2 years before they get any protection against unfair dismissal. Precariousness, risk and uncertainty are the defining characteristics of work for too many, but the defining characteristics for ministers' jobs are reward, and this is reward that comes whatever the length of service and whatever the reason for their departure. And that really is the bit that so many of my constituents will feel shows how this is one rule for the elite and another for everybody else. We know in most workplaces, if you break the rules, you're out, no compensation. But here, if you break the rules, well, you might be out, but you might be back again in a few weeks later. But either way, you still win because you can expect a handsome payoff no matter the reason for your departure. We have a government literally rewarding bad behaviour. No wonder so many people look at this place and think politicians have no understanding of how the real world works. It's about time we refresh the way we do politics and put service of the public ahead of service of ourselves.
Thanks. Cunningham.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to contribute to the important points that have already been made by my right honourable and honourable friends and thoroughly ignored by those opposite. I want to look specifically at the proposed reform related to how the severance payment should be calculated for outgoing ministers. When these rules were originally introduced, I'm confident that the expectation was that any individual claiming 3 months of severance would almost certainly have served a decent length of time in that post. In fact, to be sure of that, I look back at the debate on the second reading of this bill 33 years ago this week, and I was struck by the words of Joe Ashton, the legendary Labour MP, who was unhappy at the idea that a minister could receive 3 months of severance after, and I quote, having had possibly only 2 years in a ministerial job. Only 2 years in a ministerial job. Can you imagine if Joe had known that 33 years on there would be members of the Whip's office claiming 3 months in severance after just 38 days in the job? It's daft, it's wrong, and it's a betrayal of the people who send us to this place. Can you imagine if we had told Joe that there would be cabinet ministers claiming almost £17,000 each after just 9 weeks as a Secretary of State? I have no doubt that if MPs who agreed those rules in 1991 had known how they would be abused 3 decades later, they would have designed the rules differently, and I am confident that they would have looked something like the proposals before us today. First, this reform would say to a minister, if you've only served a few weeks on the front bench, then your severance will be calculated at a quarter of a few weeks' salary, not a quarter of a full year's salary. That is clear, sensible and fair. Second, where a minister has served most of the year as a junior level, but has been elevated to the cabinet for a few weeks, this reform would say that their severance should be calculated as a quarter of their actual earnings over the past year, not just a quarter of their final annual salary. Again, clear, sensible and fair. Now, critics of these changes might argue that what happened in 22-23 was a one-off and that they don't warrant wholesale changes in the rules. They might say that Joe Ashton didn't envisage ministers claiming 3 months severance after less than 3 months' work, but that he also didn't envisage that there would be 3 different Prime Ministers in the space of 16 weeks. Abnormal circumstances produce abnormal results. I accept that, but once a loophole in the rules is revealed, then the loophole ought to be closed. And when a loophole is as grossly abused as we've seen in the last financial year, then we have an absolute duty to act on it. We owe that to the British taxpayer, and I'd say we also owe it to our predecessors in this House, Joe Ashton and all, who could never have contemplated the law which they passed in 1991 would be used, or maybe even abused, in this way. And let us remember, and the member for Edinburgh West made this very, very clear, ministers don't lose their day job when they're sacked or they decide to resign. They actually still have their £86,000 a year salary as a Member of Parliament. Surely that's enough. So you will know, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I'm fully behind today's motion, but feel it could have gone a little bit further on one related issue, which I wanted to briefly address, and that's the annual public duty cost allowance paid to former Prime Ministers after their departure from office. And of course that was raised by my honourable member, the member for Kempton, earlier on. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with that allowance, I hope nobody in here is, and I think that will include the vast majority of taxpayers in my constituency and around the country, the current rules stipulate that when a Prime Minister leaves their post, they're entitled not just to a one-off severance payment of almost £19,000, but they're also entitled to a payment of £115,000 every single year for the rest of their lives to assist them in their future work. Now, a member opposite, whose constituency I don't recollect, challenged my right honourable friend, the member for Islington South and Finsbury, asking if she would remove from former Prime Ministers the money for their security. No one on this side would do so. But the House will be interested to know that the government website has something to say about this. It says the cost for this allowance can include managing an office, handling correspondence as a former Prime Minister, and support with visits and similar activities. This allowance is not paid to support private or parliamentary duties, nor is it used for security purposes. So agreeing with us would not be a problem to the particular member. Like the severance payments we are debating today, it does not matter how long someone has served as Prime Minister, and it doesn't matter the circumstances under which they depart. The law states that once they've held that position, the public duty cost allowance is theirs for life. And of course, that has left us in the frankly ridiculous position where the former member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, and I did tell her I was mentioning her today, is able to claim that allowance despite bringing disgrace on his office. Sorry, I made a mistake there. The former member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip is able to claim that allowance despite bringing disgrace to his office and bringing shame on this House, and where the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk, who I have informed, will receive £115,000 a year from the taxpayer towards her public roll costs after spending just 7 weeks in the job. That's £3,200 a year, every year of her life, for each day that she spent in office. The expression made famous by the Right Honourable Lady herself, at that time I believe in relation to the high level of fruit and cheese imports, is very apt here. This is a disgrace. Now, the Honourable Member, the Right Honourable Member, is relatively young, and I wish her long life, but she could end up taking millions from the taxpayer over the next 3, 4, 5 decades. Yes, that is a disgrace. There is no public scrutiny of this allowance, unlike the MP's office cost allowance, which can be claimed in addition to this huge sum of money. To my mind, both these former Prime Ministers have brought the public duty cost allowance into disrepute, just as surely as some of their colleagues have brought severance payments into disrepute. I think there is a strong case for reforming both systems rather than just the latter.
Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's my birthday today, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I can think of no higher honour than being called to speak in the House of Commons on this day. And I do consider it an enormous honour to be serving as the Member of Parliament for the good and amazing people of Putney, Southfields, Roehampton and Wandsworth Town. And I'm speaking about 97 ministers for whom they must have thought all their birthdays had come at once in the summer of chaos when they were handed out additional sums which were excessive and undeserved within the ministerial severance pay scandal, which we're throwing a light on today. And it's been questioned about whether this is an important debate by members opposite, and I would say absolutely it's important. In fact, it comes to the heart of our democracy that when we stand here in the House of Commons, even on our birthday, when we go out into our constituencies and we ask what the issues are that we should take back, when we vote here in this House, it is based on trust. It's based on the trust and confidence of our constituents. But issues like the additional, excessive and undeserved ministerial severance pay bring into disrepute this House and question the confidence that our constituents have. Ipsos's latest poll of trust showed that only 9% of voters trust politicians to tell the truth. That's the lowest since they started asking that question in 1983, and that's down from a pretty low bar of 12% in 2022. In June last year, the Institute for Public Policy Research showed that just 6% of the public have full trust in the current political system. These are sobering statistics, and it does not have to be this way, Mr Deputy Speaker. The longer this government clings on to office, the more out of touch they are, and the more people feel that it's one rule for them and another for the rest of us. The complete Tory chaos of the summer of 2022 has had long-term effect on our economy, crippling mortgage bills of my constituents in Putney, but it also resulted in a summer of huge payoffs for ministers who waltzed in and out of office, did very little because they didn't have the time and ability to, and picked up not only extra pay for this time in office, but then the severance pay as well. One example of this, real-world example, was that I've been campaigning for a long time on the cladding crisis for my constituents. But all through that summer, effectively, that issue was put on hold because there were only temporary ministers who knew they wouldn't be in power for very long, so they couldn't make any decisions. And we had a whole summer lost on an issue of huge importance to my constituents. So this is not just an abstract issue about pay and conditions. It's actually had real-world consequences this summer of chaos. And I thank my honourable friend, the Shadow Attorney-General, for uncovering the extent of this and the fact that in 2022-3 alone, the total bill for ministers' severance pay was an unacceptable £933,000. Many had their jobs for just a few weeks in the dying days of Boris Johnson's time or in the cabinet of the doomed 45 days premiership of the honourable member for South West Norfolk, who have informed that I will be mentioning her. They received 3 months' severance pay, but one returned to the cabinet after 6 weeks, another after 2 months, one after 3.5 months, another after 4 months. One returned to exactly the same job 9 weeks after leaving, but still had the full 12 weeks' severance pay. This Labour motion would stop this and reduce the amount of severance pay for these serial cabinet returnees. The amount of pay shouldn't be 3 months, regardless of time served. Some ministers served for just 7 weeks and received the full 3 months of pay. 57 ministers served for less than the 3 months that they had. Some have returned this, and as other members have mentioned, this is to be commended. But many have not, and we don't really know the extent of how many have returned it or not because, as has been pointed out, we won't receive the departmental accounts for a long time to come. Five ministers also received a total of almost £50,000 despite being ineligible because they were over 65. Now, whether being 65 has any bearing on whether or not you should receive severance pay, I think is an issue for another day. But the fact that this was incompetently delivered as well as wrongly delivered is an issue. But I'd like to compare these to the noble Lord Rooker. He served for 26 years in this House as the MP for Perry Barr. He has served with equal distinction in the other place for more than 20 years since. He is a hugely dedicated parliamentarian and public servant. He gave 11.5 years continuous service as a minister from May 1997 to October 2008 before he finally stepped down at the age of 67. Despite that length of service, he received no severance payment because those were the rules. And yet under these rules, you can be a minister for 2 days and still receive 3 months severance pay. The rules clearly were not intended for the circumstances that we saw in the last 2 years and do need to be reformed, as the Minister said in her opening remarks. So I welcome that reform. We, on this side of the House, do not believe that the government is willing to reform them, and so that is why we're bringing in this motion today. They have brought, for far too long, Conservative ministers have been paid off, effectively, for jumping aboard a sinking ship. They've brought a system put in place in 1991 into disrepute, and it's nothing short of a complete waste of taxpayers' hard-earned money. Labour is calling for this action urgently because we cannot afford another £1 million bill if the Conservative Prime Minister, the latest Conservative Prime Minister, cannot keep his party together. And all of this at a time when the country has been going through the worst cost of living crisis in generations. This draining of resources is simply disgraceful. And when I think of the community centre that I ran before I became an MP, when I think of the amounts that we would spend on our different projects and the amount of good that could be done in our community by each of those sums, it's just not comparable. And the wastage is felt very much on the doorsteps as well by people that I speak to who have this feeling that we're all on the take. And that's the problem with this policy of these ministerial severance pays. It's just added to that feeling. So, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She's making a very powerful speech, as always. I think what hit home for me, and I hope she will agree with this point, is the fact that for the member for Great Yarmouth, the payments that he was paid out, which I think was £33,500, £570. It is almost identical to the mean average salary of a UK citizen. And this was just a bonus payment payoff. Isn't that an outrage?
I agree, and I think all of our constituents would agree with that. It just doesn't seem right that these large sums of money have been paid out for many cases, such a short term of service. And that's not what the system was designed to do at all, and so the system must be reformed. It's high time that the Conservative summer of chaos that has exposed this system, exactly as outlined, and resulted in a nearly £1 million payout for a conveyor belt of Tory ministers is reviewed. So to make sure the public gets good value for money from its government ministers, Labour is making proposals today, proposals that are sensible and reasonable and should be supported by all members of the House. Labour will change the rules that Labour will change the rules so that failed ministers who've only been in the post a matter of weeks are no longer entitled to a quarter of their final top annual salary, but instead will receive a quarter of their actual earnings over the previous 12 months as a minister, minus any period covered by a previous severance entitlement. And if they return to a ministerial position after 3 weeks, but within the period equivalent to the number of days of salary they were paid in severance, they must return the corresponding amount of their severance payment. At the moment, this is just up to the goodwill of a minister who, out of the goodness of their heart, returns the money. Actually, it shouldn't be left like that. It should be very clear-cut within the system. Labour would also ensure that any minister who's had to leave their job whilst they're being investigated for misconduct has their severance suspended and then cancelled altogether if the allegations are upheld. Really, I don't think we should be putting forward this legislation. It should be so obvious. It should have been brought forward as soon as the system was brought into disrepute by this happening with previous former members. And it shouldn't be up to the opposition, really, to be calling out the government on the failure of the system. Labour will go much further than this if we have the honour of becoming the government. We will also bring in an integrity and ethics commission to go far further to clean up our politics, because trust in our politics has plummeted to an all-time low in recent years. And so it must be up to us in the Labour Party to clean up politics, to restore trust and show that it is not one rule for them and another for us. We're putting the government on notice today. If they won't clean up our politics, Labour will.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I don't know if I'm alone in finding the contributions from the government benches to be rather prickly and defensive. I listened to the opening speech from the Minister for Common Sense, the Minister for such nonsense today, because she made a speech that not only didn't touch on the motion at all, and that was a theme followed by, I think, almost everyone on the Conservative benches in that way, but which, well, was just simply very poor. I mean, maybe that she wanted to show her disdain for the motion by instructing her office to draft something of that quality. But I think that's unfair, because actually what the Attorney General and the Cabinet Office Minister have done in preparing for this debate is actually quite a lot of detailed work about 97 members of the government over a relatively short period, and it doesn't propose punitive remedies. It simply removes the abuses from the system, and it leaves sums of money there for. It's not against the principle of severance, and indeed she's been criticised for that by members of the Conservative benches rather confusingly, and it addresses specific anomalies. So it addresses, first of all, mistake, and I think, to be fair to the government, they've accepted that where a mistake has been made and money paid in error, that should be refunded. I think we can probably all agree on that. It's addressed what I think has been described as the bone anomaly, or the bone pincher anomaly, which is where there has been clear misconduct. And I think it could be quite difficult for members on either side to defend that either. But she's also identified excessive amounts of pay, where either the minister has served for a short period of time, or where their salary has gone up dramatically, and that their severance pay is based on the end salary, which is substantially above. And finally, in a way, I think this is the easiest to understand where a minister has been sacked or resigned, has received their 3 months' money, and then is reappointed to the same or a very similar job within those 3 months, that they shouldn't get double bubble, as it were, in that sense. And I can't see any objection, really, to any of that. It's very close to being unjust enrichment in all cases. And the remedy for that is restitution. It's to provide redress in circumstances where one party has received a benefit from another, in circumstances where it would be unjust for the recipient to retain the benefit. Well, the donor here is the taxpayer, and the recipient, with very little excuse, is, as we've said in this case, 97 ministers. And it's not really, as the member for Northampton North said, ad hominem attacks. Yes, of course, we have to identify specific and individual ministers in that way, but it's the collective system that is being criticised here. And some may say that that was an exceptional year. And, well, let's see what happens this year, shall we? And we might be in for another exceptional year this year. But even if it were an exceptional year, and the sum of £1 million, which is a very large sum of money, is not going to be repeated, there is a principle at stake here as well. And I mean, I could run through, to show it's not ad hominem, I could run through all 97 cases, but I couldn't be bothered to email all the offices in order to do that. But as I was emailing the right member for Chelsea and Fulham's office anyway, because he spends most of his time canvassing in my constituency now, or at least the parts that I'm transferring to him, and I spend a lot of my time canvassing in his. I thought I would add on that I would mention him in this debate. And it's nothing personal, it never is, between neighbours in that way. But it's a pretty clear case, because he backed the wrong horse when the member for South West Norfolk was elected as Prime Minister, lost his job, but got his severance, his three months severance, which is a sum, I think, of £7,920. But then 33 days later, when the member for South West Norfolk was already running out of friends, she reappointed him. She appointed him into her government at that point. Now, under the system that the Shadow Attorney-General has outlined, he would have received severance payment there. He would have received a severance payment of £2,886, some £5,034 less than that he received. I say, well, perhaps he deserved it. Well, I'm not so sure, because what that means is that whereas for the first month out of office he was being paid through his severance, for the next 2 months he was being paid both his severance and his salary. He was quite literally getting double the money for that period of time. Now, it may be, he hasn't responded to me to say that he's paid that all to the local Labour Party or some other deserving charitable body in the interim, but it's not a charity in law, but one with many charitable aspects to its operation. Perhaps he has. I hope he has. I hope all 97 will take that course of action. I'm sure the Shadow Attorney-General will be writing to all of them individually to invite them to make those payments back, because it's no way to deal with public money. I'm not going to go on about the right member for Chelsea Fulham, because I think he will be dealt with by his electorate in due course and in fairly short order, and the excellent Labour candidate Ben Coleman for Chelsea and Fulham, and many have been down to support him in that way, will be a refreshing change as the new MP in that way. And the minister I see sitting there, who is a resident of that constituency, is clearly considering what options he may take when he's called upon to do that. But this is, and I'll conclude on this. This is a serious point. We shouldn't play fast and loose with public money in that way. We shouldn't misuse public resources. And when we are, to say through no fault of our own, unjustly enriched in that way, we should make reparation. Yeah. That's all this motion is calling for. And I think it's difficult on that basis for members opposite to oppose it. And we'll see when we vote in a few moments' time whether that is the case. So all that we've heard about red herrings about other payments that may be made to ministers or MPs in that way, if we think, as many members have made this point, we think of our own constituents, the hard times they are going through, it does make us look out of touch if we say, well, it's only £5,000, it's only £25,000 in some cases, and, you know, I've done a good job and I've worked hard, so do my constituents, and they are not rewarded in this way. And I think if members could focus for a few moments when we come to the vote on that motion, that they will find it's not too difficult to vote with us.
Mayor Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to do the wind-up today for the debate that we have had. Now, my right honourable friend, the member for Islington, South and Finsbury, and other members on this side of the House have laid out very clearly why we need reform, why rules that never envisage the churn and chaos that we've seen over the past 18 months need to be tightened up. So we've heard from numerous members on this side of the House and one or two members from the other side of the House as well. The member for Aberdeen North, the spokesperson for the SNP, emphasised just how out of touch this government is, reminding us of the stark choices that many of our constituents have to make between heating and eating. My honourable friend, the member for Sefton Central, gave the case of the 3 assistant whips getting 2.5 times more in severance pay than in salary, taking away some £4,479 each, whereas under our reforms they would only be entitled to £454. He also made the point very clearly that under our leadership, under the Labour government, we had 2% growth, whereas sadly under this government we have seen only 1%, and that has a huge knock-on effect for all of our constituents. Turning then to my honourable friend from Hornsey and Wood Green, she again made reference to the hardship faced by her constituents, hammered, of course, by record peacetime tax burdens, and called for some contrition from Tory ministers. My honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere, Port and Neston, pointed out the anomaly that under the current system, just for one day in the post of Secretary of State, an MP can receive some £16,000 in severance pay. And that is why reform is really needed. And he contrasted this with his expert knowledge of what ordinary people can expect in terms of statutory redundancy pay and the horrible shadow of 0 hours contracts, where very often they're worried about whether they'll have enough hours to make ends meet. My honourable friend for Stockton North pointed out that back in 1991, MPs like Joe Ashton were even questioning whether a full 13 weeks should be payable for just 2 years. He would certainly have been astounded at MPs taking ministerial severance pay after just a few weeks. My honourable friend for Putney pointed out how nothing got done in the summer of 2022 about matters of immense importance, like cladding, which is a really important issue for many of her constituents. Labour in government, she reminded us, have full plans for a proper ethics and integrity commission to clean up politics. And then my honourable friend for Hammersmith made a strong case for reform, illustrating it with the case of the member for Chelsea and Fulham. The member for Edinburgh West reminded us that there is genuinely a valid case for reform, proper reform of ministerial severance pay, especially with the rapid turnover of ministerial posts, whilst constituents are paying for the way that the Tories have crushed the economy. Now, front bench speakers, as a former teacher and examiner, I do have to say that not adhering to the title is usually rewarded with 0 out of 10 if you do not adhere to the title of the question. So perhaps for the member for Southend West, maybe 1 out of 10, Northampton North and Broadland, maybe 2 to 3. And as for the minister, well, I think my honourable friend for Fulham has, my honourable friend, the member for Hammersmith, has made a very clear case about what we think of that particular speech. So I really do hope that the Minister, my opposite number in the Cabinet Office team, in his closing remarks, will actually address the content of our reforms and not just a tirade against the Labour Party. So, I do... I will very briefly give way.
I would be very interested to know. I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'd be very interested to know what score then would she give each of the 4 Labour leadership candidates who did not give back a single penny of their severance pay after losing the general election and leaving this country with no money whatsoever in 2010.
Well, actually, I'm going to stick to the topic of debate. As it might surprise you. It might surprise you, which is on severance pay. Now, I do actually pay tribute, as indeed did my right honourable friend, to members, like the members from Macclesfield, Hexham and North East Cambridgeshire, who, I understand, did give back some ministerial severance pay upon taking up new ministerial posts. But it's a great pity that there were not more members who recognised how totally inappropriate it is to take 13 weeks severance pay for a post they'd held for a much shorter time than that, or to keep the full 13-week severance pay when they were reappointed in a shorter time than that. Today, they have the opportunity to vote to reform the system which their party has brought into disrepute. Now, those in government have a duty to get value for money, a duty to respect the hard-earned taxpayers' money that they're entrusted with. And let's not forget the financial turmoil caused by the then Prime Minister, the member for South West Norfolk and her team, pushing through the budget in September 2022, ignoring expert advice and leaving people with hundreds of extra pounds to pay on their mortgages, not just for a couple of months, but for years to come. Yeah. And from this Conservative government, it's been not just higher mortgages, but higher rents, rampant inflation, a real cost of living crisis with people up and down the country struggling to make ends meet, and of course public services hollowed out, scarcely able to meet demand. Now, when the Ministerial Severance Payment Scheme was set up back in 1991, no one would have imagined the absolute pantomime that we've seen over the past couple of years, with nearly 100 ministers leaving office and taking with them some £993,000. That's nearly £1 million of hard-earned taxpayers' money in ministerial severance pay. Back in 1991, the expectation would have been that ministers would be in post for a number of years, and then that those leaving under the age of 65 would receive a quarter of their final annual salary, some 13 weeks' pay as severance pay. But fast forward to the summer of 2022, when we saw MPs hastily appointed to fill gaps after the frenzied mass resignations from the Johnson government, supporters of the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk brought in to serve under her time at number 10. And then supporters of the current Prime Minister, who resigned from their ministerial jobs to put pressure on his predecessors, only to return a few weeks later when he became Prime Minister. Now, we're not saying that the rules were broken, except in the case of the handful of over 65s who are not entitled to severance pay, because under the existing rules, the rest of those Tory ministers were legally entitled to 3 months of severance pay at their final salary level, no matter how long they'd been in post, no matter how they came to lose their post, and in most cases, no matter how quickly they returned to the front bench afterwards. These are the glaring loopholes that Labour's proposed reforms will seek to close. Yeah. Reforms that would have saved the taxpayer some 40% of the payouts, namely some £377,000 if they'd been in place in 2022. Did the Honourable Member wish to intervene?
I'm very grateful the Honourable Lady was referencing value for the taxpayer and hard-working contributions from those people who send us here. So would she be able to support the ongoing freeze of ministerial salaries were Labour to come into power?
Yeah. Well, as I've said, Mr. Gale, I am absolutely going to speak to the topic on the order paper. I'm not going to be distracted by any other topic. Now, as I said, we would be, if the reforms that we propose were in place, then that would have saved the taxpayer some 40% of the money. That is some £377,000 if they'd been in place in 2022. Because what we've seen in the Tory turmoil of the last couple of years is some ministers receiving more in severance pay than in actual pay. So ministers, for example, who only serve for a matter of weeks, perhaps only serving for 8 or 9 weeks, have then been entitled to walk away with 13 weeks severance pay. That is clearly totally absurd and unacceptable. What Labour is proposing is a pro rata system, where those ministers who serve for less than a full year should only receive in severance pay a quarter of what they have actually earned. In other words, if they've been in post for 8 months, then they would be entitled to 2 months severance pay. If they've been in post for 8 weeks, then they'd be entitled to 2 weeks severance pay. Likewise, we're proposing to strengthen the rules concerning ministers who are reappointed. Under the existing rules, ministerial severance pay is only withheld if the departing minister takes up another post within 3 weeks of quitting, which covers a normal reshuffle situation. But in the light of the revolving door that we've seen, with some ministers returning after more than 3 weeks but less than 13 weeks, and yet keeping their full severance pay, which is in accordance with the current rules, that is another loophole that our proposals would seek to close. In other words, individuals who return to the front bench while still benefiting from severance pay would have that severance pay clawed back. So, for example, if a minister were entitled to 8 weeks severance pay but took up another ministerial post after 5 weeks, then they should clearly forego the remaining 3 weeks severance pay, as they would be, of course, receiving their new ministerial salary. And thirdly, we're proposing that individuals who leave their jobs while under investigation for gross misconduct or breaches of the ministerial code would not receive any severance pay unless and until they were cleared of those allegations by the relevant authority. And so we would not be in the situation where the disgraced former member for Tamworth, who should never have been appointed in the first place, has been able to walk away with full ministerial severance pay. Likewise, the shameful behaviour of the former member for Wellingborough was no bar to him taking severance pay under the current rules, but as he's over 65, he should never have had the payout in the first place. In fact, Mr Deputy Speaker, nearly £50,000 was wrongly paid out to former ministers who were over 65 at the time when they left their posts. One would hope that the handful of individuals involved would pay back that severance pay immediately, as indeed I believe that the former member for Mid-Bedfordshire, Nadine Dorris, has promised to do. Perhaps the Minister, in his closing remarks, could update us as to whether Miss Dorris has indeed repaid that money, and also on what progress has been made in clawing back the severance payments that were wrongly made to other ministers over the age of 65. Because make no mistake, ordinary citizens owing money to the HMRC or to the DWP would certainly be expected to repay it in a timely fashion. Furthermore, I would ask the Minister to address the content of each of our proposals and say whether or not his government will support them, and if not, why not. And now I appeal to members opposite to do the decent thing and to support Labour's reforms and to support bringing forward the necessary legislation in the next fortnight, as set out in our motion on the order paper, because if they don't support it, we'll have to conclude that they're more interested in lining their own pockets than protecting the taxpayers' money. I commend this motion to the House.
Minister. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to begin by wishing the Honourable Lady from Putney a very happy birthday. Yeah, we are delighted to be spending it with her in these conditions. We can only imagine, Mr Deputy Speaker, the scenes, the absolute scenes in Labour HQ that preceded this debate. You know, the heirs to Bevan, to Attlee, to Wilson, to Mandelson, wrestling with the great issues of the day, wondering what they will bring to the mother of all parliaments for this Opposition Day debate. Would it be the war in Ukraine, future of NATO, the conflict in the Middle East, the situation in the Red Sea, Children's Mental Health Week, the failure of the NHS in Labour-run Wales, collapse of Labour-led Birmingham, the Apprenticeship Week, Mayor of London's failure to control crime, deep fakes and the future of democracy, the strength of UK manufacturing, the halving of inflation? No, Mr Deputy Speaker. The eureka moment when it came was reform of the Ministerial and Other Pensions and Salaries Act 1991. They have waited 33 years for this moment, and now they're going to strike. You can imagine the panic giving way to relief as they set about handing out their lines to eager backbenchers. But this motion, Mr. Speaker, has given the country something it did not have before. That rarest of beasts, that most elusive of fowl, the red squirrel, or the red-footed booby of politics, a Labour policy. And to be fair, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's not utter chod. The truth is that the legislation from 1991 has been on the books for a long time, a very long time, a third of a century, and it is due for review. And when that time comes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it will be right to consider a number of things. It will be right to consider the length of service and severance pay. It will be right to consider those who swiftly re-enter work after a period out of it. And it will be right to consider the status of those who are under investigation when they lose their job. And I say consider, Mr. Deputy Speaker, very particularly, because as you will know, as the whole House will know, that is how we legislate in this place. We consult, we debate, we consider. And when this subject is next considered, there will be other issues that Labour did not have time to put in their motion, that they scrabbled it together at the last minute. My honourable friend from North East Bedfordshire raised the issue of whether there should be severance pay at all. That would need to be debated. My honourable friend from Bracknell is asked whether the the law on over 25s and severance pay was right. It needs to be considered. A number of honourable members question the status of former Prime Ministers. It should be considered. There will be other issues, many other issues. And as I say, when the time comes to do this, the government will consult, it will consider, and it will allow proper time for debate, not the less than 2 hours that the Labour motion would give to committee stage for this legislation. Yeah, it's an absolutely ridiculous way of going about trying to pass legislation, Mr. Speaker. It is, as my honourable friend, right honourable friend says from a sedentary position, amateur. Now, this government is not going to legislate on this issue before the general election, Mr. Deputy Speaker, not because the issue is not important, but because there are other things that are more important. Because we understand priorities, we understand our constituents' priorities. A point very well made by my right honourable friend from Tatton. We are going to be legislating supporting renters and leaseholders. We're going to be legislating backing a free press with our media bill. We're going to be legislating to strengthen law and order with our sentencing bill and with criminal justice bill, the victims and prisoners bill. We'll be strengthening animal welfare, making legislation to strengthen our economy with the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. We'll be giving greater power to our national security forces with the Investigating Powers Bill. All these things, Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, and more, because they are our priorities, they are our voters' priorities. We look forward to the next Conservative government after the next general election having a chance to consider these and many other issues. But it will be done properly, not in a panicked opposition day debate by desperate opposition, scrabbling for something to say. As my honourable friend from Southend West said, this is a smokescreen for a lack of policy. It is a political game, and this government will not support it.
Question is, as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobbies. As on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tell us for the ayes, Joel Jones, Kim Leadbitter. Tell us for the noes, Suzanne Webb, Gagan Mahindra. Beg your pardon. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 192. The noes to the left, 275.
The ayes to the right were 192. The noes to the left were 275. So the noes have it. Unlock. Motion number 3, international immunities and privileges.
I beg to move.
Question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Motion number 4, financial services and markets.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Point of order, Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.